April 12, 1941. Tobruk, Libya. The air tastes of chalk and oxidized metal. The heat, even at 9 in the morning, is already a physical weight pressing down on the chest, not just from the relentless sun of the Libyan desert, but from the fine alkaline dust that hangs suspended, refusing to settle. Corporal Leslie Bluey Thompson, 24 years old, of the 213th Australian Infantry Battalion, is crouched in what should be a trench, but is in reality little more than a shallow scar dug into limestone rock as hard as bone. His hands are shaking, not from fear, but from the residual vibration of the artillery that hammered the perimeter throughout the previous night. He grips a Lee Enfield 303 rifle, the wood of the stock worn and oily, hot to the touch. Leslie rubs his thumb over the edge of the bolt, a nervous tic he has developed over the last 3 weeks, feeling the grit of the sand that seems to penetrate even the pores of his skin. His eyes, red from sleep deprivation and constant irritation, scan the flat, shimmering horizon to the south, where the desert dissolves into a mirage of liquid heat. He is not alone, but the empty vastness before him makes him feel like the last man on earth. Leslie's jaw is clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck ache, a constant tension that has become his natural state. He spits on the ground, saliva brown with dust and cheap tobacco, and checks the horizon again. They are coming. He knows they are coming. Just 2 months earlier, Leslie was a sheep shearer in New South Wales, worried about wool prices and the drought. Today, he is a living statistic in a global chess game he barely understands. The Australian 9th Division, surrounded on 3 sides by the world's best armour and on the 4th by the Mediterranean Sea, has an impossible mission: to hold a vital port against Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, a man who has never lost an offensive battle. 241 days. That is the number that will echo through history. But Leslie doesn't know that yet. For him, the future is not measured in days, but in minutes of survival. He has already seen men die. He has seen what German Stukas do to an unprotected truck convoy, bodies turned into something resembling nothing human. But now, something different is forming beyond that ridge of sand. It is not just another raid. It is a storm of steel calculated to crush Australian morale into dust. In exactly 4 hours and 18 minutes, the Panzer tanks of the Afrika Korps will initiate what German intelligence believes to be the final blow. They promise a quick, clean, and decisive victory. What Rommel never understood, what his generals in Berlin failed to calculate at their pristine map tables, is the nature of the man they have cornered. They looked at the maps and saw cut supply lines, antiquated fortifications, and inexperienced troops. They saw an obvious victory. They had something far more dangerous waiting for them than mere weapons. They had the Australian contempt for authority, the stubbornness born in arid lands, and an almost suicidal capacity for improvisation. The Germans expected an honourable surrender. What they would find would be a war of rats, fought with rusty bayonets, tin cans of bully beef turned into grenades, and a ferocity that would make the Wehrmacht elite themselves question their superiority. If you want to understand how a group of men labelled amateurs and rabble broke the backbone of the legend of German invincibility, you need to look at the exact moment when military logic collided with human obstinacy. Subscribe now, because this is the story of how the rats of Tobruk bit back. To understand why the Siege of Tobruk represented such a psychological and tactical shock for the Afrika Korps, you need to go back to early 1941, to the genesis of Blitzkrieg in North Africa. German doctrine was not just a strategy, it was a philosophy of kinetic violence. They called it Bewegungskrieg, or maneuver warfare, refined on the battlefields of Poland in 1939 and France in 1940. Heinz Guderian and Rommel himself had proven that speed was the best armor. The central premise was simple and brutal: concentrate overwhelming force at a narrow point, break through enemy lines, and then cause chaos in the rear, cutting communications and supplies. The enemy, paralyzed by shock and speed, would collapse before they could even mount a coherent defense. It made perfect rational sense. It had worked against larger and better equipped armies in Europe. They believed that static warfare, the trench warfare of World War I, was obsolete, dead and buried under the tracks of their panzers. German technical confidence was not unfounded arrogance. It was based on cold, hard specifications. The Panzer III and Panzer IV were marvels of engineering. The Panzer III AUSFG, with its 50mm KWK-38 cannon, could pierce the armour of most British tanks at ranges where the Allies could barely scratch the German paint. They trusted their precision Zeiss optics, which allowed German gunners to identify and engage targets with a clarity the British could only dream of. They trusted their radios, installed in every tank, allowing for fluid tactical coordination that contrasted with the flag signals and intermittent radio communications of the Allies. There were precedents: the fall of France in 6 weeks, the annihilation of Soviet armies in the opening months of Operation Barbarossa that would follow, and the initial victories in Africa itself. Rommel had arrived in February 1941 and, within weeks, pushed the British back hundreds of miles, capturing Benghazi and surrounding Tobruk. Captured documents show German officers referring to Allied forces as disorganized and slow. They believed in the superiority of the German warrior, trained for individual initiative within the chaos of battle, against the democratic conscript soldier, seen as soft and dependent on rigid orders. But this was not blind ignorance. The Abwehr, German intelligence, possessed detailed information. They knew the number of divisions in Tobruk. They knew about the water shortage. They knew the anti-aircraft artillery was inadequate. They knew the Australians were using captured Italian weapons because they didn't have their own in sufficient quantity. What they did not capture, what they could not internalize until that fateful April, was the fundamental difference in the psychology of the soldier they faced. They viewed the disobedience and lack of formal discipline of the Australians as weakness. They viewed the lack of saluting officers, the sloppy uniforms, the irreverent attitude as signs of an undisciplined army about to disintegrate under pressure. What they interpreted as chaos was, in fact, a radical form of egalitarianism that made every Australian soldier capable of thinking and acting independently when the chain of command broke. The epistemological failure was catastrophic. They confused formality with efficiency. The Germans prepared for a maneuver battle, where they would flank and encircle. They wasted tons of precious fuel and wear on their vehicles maneuvering in the desert, hoping to lure the Australians out. But the Australians didn't come out. They dug in. And when you dig in the limestone desert, you don't just create a defensive position, you become part of the hostile geology. The Germans brought maneuver maps to a knife fight in a phone booth. They would have needed medieval siege tactics or heavy assault infantry on a scale Rommel did not possess and, frankly, despised. The contempt for static defense blinded them to the lethality of a static defense that refused to act statically. Leslie Bluey Thompson was born on August 14, 1916, in Dubbo, New South Wales, son of Arthur Thompson, a World War I veteran who returned from Gallipoli missing 2 fingers on his left hand and with lungs burned by mustard gas, and of Mary Thompson, a stoic primary school teacher who held the family together with faith and rigid discipline. Leslie was the second of 4 brothers. His older brother, Jack, was already serving in the Merchant Navy. Leslie grew up listening to his father's silence about the war, a silence that screamed louder than any story of heroism. Before putting on the khaki uniform, Leslie was a shearer. It wasn't a job for the weak. It required a back of steel, hands that could hold a 50-kilogram struggling sheep, and the precision of a surgeon not to cut the animal or himself with the sharp shears. He worked 10 hours a day, bent over, sweating liters paid by the head. This gave him a physical endurance that no military training camp could replicate. He dreamed of owning his own sheep station one day, perhaps near Orange, where the land was a little greener. He liked woodworking in his spare time, carving small animals for his nephews, a hobby that required patience and attention to detail, traits that would save his life in Tobruk. But there was a fear in him, a fear he would never admit aloud, the fear of failing his mates, the fear of being the weak link, the fear that cowardice was hereditary, for he had seen his father cry during storms, shaking uncontrollably. Leslie enlisted in May 1940, not out of blind patriotism, but because all his friends were going. It was what one did. Social pressure was a gravitational force. His mother cried silently in the kitchen when he broke the news. His father just looked at him with empty eyes and said, "Keep your head down, son, and never trust a British officer." Leslie's military journey began in Sydney, at the showground, transformed into a recruitment camp. Basic training at Ingleburn was a shock, but not physically. Physically, Leslie was tougher than his instructors. The shock was the submission. Marching, saluting, cleaning buttons. It seemed useless. But there he met men like Diver Derrick and Bluey O'Brien, men who would become his new family. He was selected for the infantry because he was big and looked capable of carrying weight. Simple as that. The army didn't waste time with psychological nuances. His first experience under live fire occurred not in Libya, but in the retreat from Greece, months earlier, albeit briefly. The sound of bullets cracking overhead, the angry buzz like invisible wasps, was terrifying. He saw a boy from Melbourne, whose name he barely remembered, have his head split open by mortar shrapnel. There was no glory, only blood, and the smell of shit and fear. Leslie vomited, but he continued to shoot. It was there that he learned the first vital lesson. Fear doesn't disappear, you just learn to function despite it. He went from scared recruit to competent soldier not by training, but by osmosis of survival. He learned to distinguish the sound of a German 81mm mortar from a British 3-inch mortar. He learned that silence is often more dangerous than noise. However, there was a moral dilemma corroding Leslie, something he carried like a stone in his stomach. During a night patrol in no man's land, days before the major attack, his sergeant ordered that no prisoners be taken if the situation got complicated. The ambiguity of the order was terrible. Leslie was raised in the Anglican Church. Thou shalt not kill was a commandment, not a suggestion, though war had added a giant asterisk to it. But executing surrendered or wounded men, that violated everything his mother had taught him about justice and decency. He talked to his mate, Smokey Dawson, while they cleaned their rifles. "It's them or us, Bluey," Smokey said, not looking him in the eye. "They won't hesitate." "Why should we?" Leslie tried to rationalize. They were Nazis, they were invaders, they were evil. But when he looked through the rifle sight, he saw only dirty and frightened men, not monsters. He wrote in his diary, found decades later in an old shoebox, "I feel like I'm losing parts of myself I'll never get back. The sand here sands down not just the skin, but the soul. I hope God understands the difference between murder and duty, because I don't know anymore." This doubt haunted him, but when the battle began, the doubt was pushed into a dark corner of his mind, replaced by the primal instinct for survival. He knew he would soon have to make choices he would live with, or die with, for the rest of his life. The technical innovation the Australians brought to Tobruk was not a new secret superweapon. It was a visceral tactical adaptation of existing tools, officially designated as aggressive defense in depth, but to the soldiers, it was simply making Jerry's life hell. To understand the lethality, one must look at the specifications. The boy's MKY anti-tank rifle, caliber 55 inches, a 16-kilogram monster that kicked like a mule. It fired a 47-gram projectile with a hardened steel core. At 100 yards, it could penetrate 23 millimeters of armor. To the engineers, it was ballistics. To Leslie, it was like trying to stop a rhinoceros with a knitting needle, unless you knew where to aim. The recoil was so violent, it broke the collarbones of men who didn't hold it correctly. The sound was a boom that left ears ringing for hours, blood trickling from the nose due to concussion. But when it hit a Panzer's track or driver's visor, the effect was catastrophic. The steel shattered, sending incandescent fragments into the tank's tight compartment, turning the interior into a meat grinder. It was a hated weapon, heavy and obsolete against the frontal armor of new Panzers. But in the hands of men who waited for the tank to pass and fired at the rear or sides, it was lethal. Another innovation was the use of the 25-pounder artillery, the Ordnance QF 25-pounder, caliber 87.6 millimeter, range 12,000 yards. But the innovation wasn't in the gun, it was in the usage. Australian gunners, ignoring British doctrine of indirect fire, lowered the barrels to fire over open sights or direct fire against attacking tanks. Imagine a field gun used as a giant shotgun. The 20-pound armor-piercing shell left the barrel at 1,700 feet per second. At that speed, the air in front of the projectile was compressed to the point of glowing. The impact on a tank at 600 yards wasn't just penetration, it was pure kinetic energy. A hit could rip the turret off a 20-ton tank, throwing it meters away like a bottle cap. The sound of the impact was a sickly clang that could be heard over the roar of battle, followed by the momentary silence of the crew killed instantly by overpressure. The development of this defensive approach wasn't linear. It began with the arrival of Major General Leslie Morshead in March 1941. Morshead, known as Ming the Merciless, looked at Tobruk's 45-kilometer perimeter and saw a disaster. The original Italian defenses were shallow ditches and poorly positioned concrete pillboxes. The first failed test was the initial attempt to defend only the outer red line. It was too long, too porous. German patrols infiltrated at night. Men died in useless skirmishes. Morshead, a World War I veteran who despised passivity, ordered a radical change. Instead of just sitting and waiting, Australians would patrol no man's land aggressively every night. The concept was to dominate the ground in front of the lines, not just behind them. The breakthrough came when they realized that German tanks, once they breached the outer line, were blind and vulnerable to infantry if the infantry didn't run. Standard doctrine said, if tanks pass, retreat. Morshead's new order was, there will be no retreat. If tanks pass, let them pass. The infantry deals with the enemy infantry following the tanks. The artillery back there deals with the tanks. It was suicidal on paper. It required men like Leslie to stay in holes in the ground while 20-ton steel monsters drove over them, the earth shaking, sand falling on their faces, hoping the tracks wouldn't crush them, to then emerge and fight the German infantry coming behind. The system worked like this. First, forward posts detected the movement. Not with radar, but with ears pressed to the ground and eyes red with tension. Second, field artillery began the interdiction barrage. Third, and crucially, infantry in the outer trenches, the red line, maintained disciplined fire, ignoring the tanks and focusing on stripping the supporting infantry away from the armored vehicles. A tank without infantry is blind and deaf. Fourth, the isolated tanks entered the killing zone, where 25-pounders and 2-pounder anti-tank guns, camouflaged and waiting in deadly silence, opened fire at point-blank range. Fifth, sappers counterattacked immobilized tanks with magnetic mines and Molotov cocktails. This wasn't the clean war of maneuver Rommel wanted. It was a street fight on an industrial scale. The result was measurable in smoking metal carcasses and the total confusion of panzer crews who, for the first time, saw their supporting infantry disappear under a storm of small arms fire, leaving them alone in the desert. This wasn't blitzkrieg based on shock and awe. It was visceral attrition, turned into defensive art. The cost in human nerves was incalculable, but the tactical effectiveness was undeniable. April 14th, 1941, 05:20 hours, Tobruk southern perimeter, post R33. The sky is lightening to a bluish-grey, cold and indifferent. Visibility is perhaps 800 meters, hampered by dust kicked up by the Khamsin wind. The sound is what hits Leslie first. It's not a sound, it's a physical sensation in the sternum. The rumble of dozens of 12-cylinder Maybach HL-120 TRM engines. The ground beneath Leslie's boots vibrates in a dissonant rhythm. He presses the rifle against his shoulder, cold metal against warm cheek. "Here come the bastards," whispers Smokey beside him. Leslie's thought is a single clear line. Don't run, just don't run. Leslie's position is on the red line, a series of fortified posts connected by barbed wire and shallow trenches. In front of them, the flat desert offers zero cover for attackers, but perfect fields of fire for defenders. The estimated German force is about 40 tanks of the 5th Panzer Regiment, followed by battalions of motorized infantry and mobile artillery. The Australians have rifles, Bren guns, some boys' anti-tank rifles, and further back the saving artillery. The orders are clear. Let the tanks pass. Isolate the infantry. The last communication from HQ was short. They are coming with everything. Give them hell. Radio silence is now total except for static. The first shot doesn't come from the Germans. It comes from an Australian 25-pounder positioned miles back, firing an illumination flare that bursts high above the German lines, bathing the desert in a hard white magnesium light. 05:22:10. Engagement distance is 600 yards. The lead German tank, a Panzer IV with a short 75mm gun, fires. The flash is a dirty yellow flare. The sound, a dry crump, arrives fractions of a second after impact. The shell passes high over Leslie's post, exploding harmlessly 200 meters behind, raising a column of earth and rock. The shockwave passes through them like an invisible hand slapping them. The smell of cordite floods the air instantly. Leslie doesn't blink. He sees the German infantry, dark silhouettes advancing behind the steel monsters. They look confident. They think the preliminary bombardment killed everyone in the holes. Inside the lead panzer, Oberleutnant Hans Weber has his eye glued to the periscopic sight. He sees dust, smoke, but no movement. They've fled or they're dead, he thinks, feeling the tank's vibration in his bones. Victory seems inevitable. He orders the driver to accelerate. At 500 yards, he doesn't see the camouflaged 2-pounder anti-tank gun under a burlap net and dry bushes to his right. The result of the first German shot was a miscalculation, assuming suppression had worked. Weber's mistake was underestimating the silence. The technical adjustment happens on the Australian side. Sergeant Jacko Miller, commander of a 2-pounder anti-tank gun, watches Weber's panzer. He doesn't use radar or computers. He uses his eyes and a memorized range table. Range 450, speed 15, target lead, half silhouette. The gunner adjusts elevation and azimuth wheels with sweaty but steady hands. The deviation of the first German shot gave them the exact location. The correction calculation is instinctive, based on hundreds of hours of training. Fire, yells Miller. Time elapsed since German shot is 45 seconds. The 2-pounder gun spits fire. The solid 40mm projectile leaves at 2,600 feet per second, 05:23:05. The impact is devastating. The projectile strikes the side of Weber's turret, exactly where the armor is thinnest, just above the junction with the chassis. The immediate visual effect is a bright spark, as if someone struck a giant magnesium match against grey steel. There is no cinematic explosion of fire yet, just a sharp metallic sound, a spang, that sounds like a hammer hitting an anvil the size of a building. The projectile does not ricochet, it punches through. Kinetic energy of 200,000 joules is transferred instantly to the vehicle's structure. Pieces of armor, turned into lethal shrapnel, fly outward from the impact point, but the true horror happens inside. For Weber and his crew, the world ends not with a bang, but with a scream of torn metal. The projectile perforates the steel plate and disintegrates into a cloud of incandescent fragments, ricocheting within the confined interior of the tank at supersonic speeds. It is the blender effect. Flesh, bone, uniforms, and equipment are ripped indiscriminately. The loader sitting next to the gun breech is decapitated instantly by a shard of armor. The heat generated by the friction of penetration ignites hydraulic oil vapor and the propellant of stored ammunition. Internal pressure rises astronomically in milliseconds. From the outside, Leslie sees the tank stop abruptly, as if it hit an invisible wall. Black, oily smoke begins to pour from the hatches. Then, the ammunition cooks off. A white flame jets from the commander's cupola like a blowtorch, followed by a secondary explosion that lifts the multi-ton turret inches into the air before it falls askew. No one gets out. The smell of burning flesh and rubber reaches Leslie's nostrils, mixing with the dust. He feels sudden nausea, but there is no time. The other tanks are reacting, traversing their turrets. The German infantry, now exposed and without the cover of their lead steel giant, drop to the ground. It is Leslie's turn. He lines up the sights of his Lee Enfield on the chest of a soldier, running to find cover behind a rock that doesn't exist. Leslie's finger tightens on the trigger. The moral dilemma has dissolved. Only the mechanics of death remain. The battle for Tobruk has truly begun, and the illusion of an easy German victory is burning along with Oberleutnant Weber's body inside that steel coffin. The silence that follows the destruction of Oberleutnant Weber's panzer is not an absence of sound, but a vacuum of shock, a split second where the desert itself seems to inhale before screaming. For Leslie Bluey Thompson, that second stretches into an eternity of hyperclarity. He sees the heat shimmer warping the air above the burning metal carcass. He sees the German infantrymen, men who moments ago were confident conquerors, now scrambling in the dirt, their shapes blurred by panic. Then the vacuum collapses. The desert erupts. It isn't a chaotic noise, it is a calculated symphony of industrial slaughter. The remaining 39 German tanks do not retreat. They are the elite of the Afrika Korps. Retreat is not in their vocabulary, not yet. They react with the predatory instinct of a wolf pack that has lost its alpha, but still smells blood. Turrets traverse with a mechanical whine that cuts through the explosions. High-velocity 50mm and 75mm cannons begin to pound the Australian forward positions. The ground around Leslie's foxhole ceases to be solid earth and becomes a fluid medium of flying rock, shrapnel, and concussive force. He is no longer fighting a war, he is fighting geology itself, which is being pulverized and thrown into his eyes, mouth, and lungs. He fires his Lee Enfield, works the bolt, click-clack, fires again. The action is mechanical, divorced from thought. He aims not at individuals, but at movement. A grey shape rises. He puts a .303 round through it. The shape falls. He feels no triumph, only the desperate need to keep the shapes away. Beside him, Smokey is feeding magazines into the Bren gun, the weapon chattering a staccato rhythm that vibrates in Leslie's teeth. "Keep them pinned, Bluey. Don't let the bastards up," Smokey screams, his voice cracking with the strain. But the tanks are getting closer. They rumble past the burning wreck of their leader, ignoring the infantry battle, pushing deeper into the perimeter. This is the moment of truth for Moorshead's gamble. The tanks are passing. They are inside the wire. The ground shakes so violently that Leslie has to brace his knees against the limestone wall of his trench to keep from falling. A Panzer III rolls past less than 20 meters to his left. The noise is deafening, a grinding roar of metal tracks on stone that drowns out even the gunfire. Leslie can smell the exhaust fumes, a hot, oily stench that burns the back of his throat. He looks up and sees the black cross on the hull, the mud caked on the road wheels, the commander's cupola rotating like a cyclops eye searching for prey. He wants to curl into a ball. Every instinct in his primate brain screams, hide, run, survive. But he stays. He stays because if he runs, the German infantry behind the tank will kill him. He stays because Jack O'Miller and the anti-tank gunners behind him are depending on the infantry to strip the tanks of their protection. As the tank passes, its rear exposed, a young soldier from Queensland named Rusty leaps from a nearby spider hole. He holds a bottle filled with a mixture of petrol and tar, a crude Molotov cocktail. With a scream that is lost in the roar, Rusty hurls the bottle at the engine deck of the Panzer. The glass shatters. The liquid ignites. Flames engulf the rear of the tank, sucking oxygen into the engine intakes. The Panzer slews to the right, tracks locking, smoke pouring from the vents. It doesn't explode, but it stops. It is a dead iron beast, but there are too many of them. The German armor pushes through the first line, then the second. They are breaking into the open ground behind the perimeter, exactly where they want to be, or so they think. What they are actually doing is driving into the kill box. Waiting for them are the 1st Royal Horse Artillery. These are British gunners, professionals who view artillery as a science, now fighting alongside the Australian rabble they once looked down upon. They are manning the 25-pounders, not dug in miles away, but positioned in open pits, barrels lowered to 0 elevation. Major General Moorshead didn't just tell them to stop the tanks, he told them to kill them. At 8 a.m., the leading German tanks, now numbering about 20, crest a small rise 2 miles inside the perimeter. They see open desert ahead toward the harbour. They think they have broken through. Then the horizon flashes. 12 25-pounders fire simultaneously. The range is less than 1,000 yards. The air is torn apart. This is not indirect fire. This is a firing squad. The first volley hits 3 tanks. One turret is blown clean off, spinning in the air like a discarded toy. Another tank takes a direct hit to the glacis plate, the shell cracking the armor and spalling lethal fragments inside, killing the driver and radio operator instantly. The third tank loses a track and spins wildly, exposing its side to a second volley. The German commanders are stunned. This is not supposed to happen. Artillery is supposed to be soft, vulnerable, something to be overrun. Instead, they are facing a wall of high-velocity fire that they cannot suppress. Chaos ensues. The German formation breaks. Individual tank commanders, realizing they are in a trap, try to maneuver, but the dust and smoke blind them. They collide with each other. They drive into minefields laid the night before by Australian sappers working in darkness. And all the while, the infantry back at the perimeter, Leslie and his mates, are holding the line against the German foot soldiers. The separation is complete. The tanks are alone, blind and dying. The infantry is pinned, leaderless and dying. The blitzkrieg has been surgically dissected, its heart cut out while it was still beating. Inside the chaos of the German retreat, there is a specific moment of realization for General Erwin Rommel. He is not at the front, but observing from a command vehicle miles away. He hears the frantic radio reports. Heavy resistance, point-blank artillery fire, infantry separated. He slams his fist against the map table. This was supposed to be a walkthrough. He is furious, but beneath the fury, there is a cold seed of doubt. He is watching his invincible division being chewed up by men he called amateurs. The irony is bitter. He, the master of improvisation, is being beaten by an army that improvises better. He orders a withdrawal, but it is too late for many. The desert floor is littered with burning tanks, their black smoke columns rising like funeral pyres, marking the death of a myth. Back at post R33, the battle has shifted from terror to a grim, grinding endurance. The German infantry, realizing their tanks are gone, try to retreat, But retreat in open desert under the midday sun against dug-in marksmen is a suicide run. Leslie is no longer firing blindly. He is picking targets. He sees a German officer standing up, waving a pistol, trying to rally his men. It is a brave, foolish gesture. Leslie aligns his sights. He holds his breath, exhaling half a lungful. The world narrows down to the tip of the foresight and the officer's tunic. Squeeze. The rifle kicks. The officer drops. Leslie feels nothing. The nausea is gone, replaced by a numbness that scares him more than the fear did. Is this what it means to be a soldier? To turn off the part of you that recognizes the humanity in another man? He looks at his hands. They are black, with grime and powder residue. They look like the hands of a stranger. Beside him, Smokey is bandaging a shrapnel wound on his arm, gritting his teeth against the pain. "We stopped 'em, Bluey," he grunts. "We actually stopped the bloody bastards." Leslie nods, but he doesn't speak. He is watching a wounded German soldier, crawling in the dust about 50 meters away. The man is dragging his legs, crying out for water in a language Leslie doesn't understand, but the tone is universal. It is the sound of a boy wanting his mother. Leslie reaches for his canteen. It is half full of warm, metallic-tasting water. He looks at the German. He looks at Smokey. He looks at the water. It is the most precious substance on earth right now. Giving it to an enemy seems insane, but Leslie cannot watch the man die like that. He crawls out of the trench. "Bluey, what the hell are you doing?" Smokey hisses. "Get back here." Leslie ignores him. He crawls on his belly, keeping low, the sharp rocks cutting his knees and elbows. Bullets still snap occasionally overhead, stragglers firing blindly. He reaches the German. The boy, he can't be more than 19, looks up at him with eyes wide with terror. He expects a bayonet. Leslie unscrews the canteen and holds it to the boy's cracked lips. The German drinks greedily, water spilling down his chin, mixing with the dust and blood on his uniform. He looks at Leslie, and for a second, there is no war. Just two young men in a hellhole, sharing water. "Danke," the boy whispers. Leslie nods and crawls back. He doesn't tell Smokey about the look in the boy's eyes. He doesn't tell him that for a brief moment. He saw his own brother, Jack. He just slides back into the trench, picks up his rifle and waits for the next attack, because there will be a next one. Rommel doesn't give up, and neither do rats. The psychological toll of the siege begins to manifest not in grand breakdowns, but in the erosion of the self. Days turn into weeks, weeks into months. The bombing is incessant. The Luftwaffe, frustrated by their inability to break the perimeter, decides to break the men. Dive bombers screech down at all hours. Artillery shells land randomly, denying sleep. The Tobruk stare becomes common, a 1,000-yard gaze in eyes sunken into dark sockets, focused on nothing and everything. Men stop talking about home because it hurts too much. They stop talking about the future because it seems like a fantasy. They talk about food. They obsess over food. Bully beef, hardtack biscuits, salty water. That is the menu. Scurvy begins to appear. Sores that won't heal. Teeth loosening in gums. Dysentery sweeps through the dugouts like a plague. Men shit themselves while manning machine guns because they are too weak to crawl to the latrines. And yet, they fight. They fight with a dark, cynical humor that baffles the Germans. They create a pirate radio station. They publish a newspaper, Tobruk Truth, filled with sarcasm and mockery of the enemy. They adopt the insult "Rats of Tobruk," meant by Lord Haw-Haw, the Nazi propaganda broadcaster, as a badge of honor. "If we are rats," Leslie writes in a letter that will never be sent, "then this is our sewer and we are the kings of it." The camaraderie deepens into something tighter than marriage, tighter than blood. They know the sound of each other's breathing. They know who snores, who cries in their sleep, who prays. They share their last cigarette, their last biscuit. They become a single organism, a collective consciousness focused on one goal: denial. Denying the Germans their prize. Denying the desert its victory. Denying death its due. This collective stubbornness is the true secret weapon. It is something technical specifications cannot measure. You cannot calculate the PSI of mateship. You cannot measure the velocity of spite. The Germans are fighting a tactical battle. The Australians are fighting an existential one. But the innovation continues. It has to. The static defense evolves into aggressive raiding. The patrols become legendary. Men like Leslie, with wool socks over their boots to muffle the sound, creep out into the darkness every night. They are ghosts in the desert. Their mission: to harass, to kill, to steal intelligence, to keep the Germans terrified. They crawl for miles, taking hours to move a few hundred yards. They wiretap German phone lines. They leave booby traps. They sneak into sleeping positions and slit throats in silence. It is brutal, intimate violence. On one such patrol in late May, Leslie finds himself inside a German perimeter wire. He is alone. He got separated from Smokey in the dark. He freezes. A German sentry walks past, so close Leslie can smell the man's cigarette smoke, can hear the leather of his boots creaking. Leslie's heart is a frantic bird in his chest, beating against his ribs. He grips his trench knife, a wicked blade made from a sharpened file. The sentry stops, turns, looks directly at the shadow where Leslie is merged with the ground. Does he see him? Leslie prepares to spring, but the sentry sighs, looks up at the stars, and moves on. Leslie exhales. He creeps forward to the objective, a command tent. He is supposed to plant a satchel charge. He sets the timer, a simple pencil detonator acid fuse. 10 minutes. He moves away, back toward the wire. As he crawls, he hears music coming from the tent. It's Mozart, a violin concerto. The beauty of it, so pure and civilized in the midst of this barbarity, stops him for a second. It is surreal. These men who kill with such efficiency also love Mozart. It makes no sense. The explosion, when it comes, sounds flat and dull in the vastness of the night, but the screams that follow are sharp. Leslie doesn't look back. He just crawls, the music still playing in his head, mixing with the screams. He returns to his lines just before dawn, covered in filth, shaking with adrenaline crash. Smokey is waiting for him with a mug of tea. "Thought you were a goner, Bluey," he says quietly. "Not yet," Leslie replies. "Not yet." By June, the heat is increasing. The flies are a plague of biblical proportions. They cover everything. You can't open your mouth without swallowing one. They cluster on the eyes of the living and the dead alike. They are the true owners of Tobruk. The water ration is cut again. A pint a day for everything. Drinking, washing, shaving. Men stop shaving. Beards grow wild and matted with dust. Uniforms rot off their bodies. They look like castaways, wild men. But their weapons are spotless. A man might be filthy, but his rifle is clean. That is the religion. The German attacks change character. The massive armored assaults stop, replaced by probing attacks, artillery duels, and the constant air war. The Stukas are terrifying. The siren, the Jericho trumpet, is designed to induce panic, and it works. Even the bravest man feels his bowels turn to water when that scream begins. You curl up in your slit trench, biting on a piece of leather or wood to keep from shattering your teeth, and you wait. The explosion is earth-shattering. The overpressure can burst lungs without a scratch on the skin. Leslie survives a near miss in July. A 500 kilos bomb lands 20 yards away, but fails to explode. It buries itself in the ground with a thud that shakes his very soul. He stares at the fin sticking out of the earth. A dud, fate, God. Sabotage by a slave worker in a German factory? He will never know. He just lights a cigarette with shaking hands and laughs. A high-pitched, hysterical sound that scares him. He is fraying at the edges. They all are. The letters from home are the only lifeline, but even they are painful. How do you explain this to someone in Dubbo? How do you explain the smell of a decomposing body in the heat? How do you explain that you are no longer the same person who left? Leslie writes, lies. "I'm fine, Mum. Eating well. Don't worry." He protects them from the truth, carrying the burden alone. This isolation is the hidden wound of every soldier. Then comes the salient. Rommel tries one last major push to crack the perimeter. He concentrates his forces on a weak point. The fighting is hand-to-hand vicious. Bayonets, shovels, rocks. It is primal. The Australians hold, but barely. Casualties mount. The cemetery at Tobruk grows, rows of simple wooden crosses in the sand. Leslie loses friends. Rusty, the boy with the Molotov, takes a sniper bullet to the neck while eating beans. He dies silently, choking on his own blood, while Leslie tries desperately to stop the flow with his fingers. The blood is hot and sticky. Rusty's eyes go from panic to nothingness in seconds. Leslie sits there for a long time after the medics take the body away, staring at his red hands. He doesn't wash them immediately. Water is too precious. He rubs them in the sand, scrubbing until the skin is raw, trying to scour away the death. That night he dreams of the sheep station. He is shearing a sheep, but when he cuts the wool, blood pours out. The sheep has Rusty's face. He wakes up screaming. his hand clamping over his own mouth instantly to stifle the sound. You don't scream in the night. It unnerves the others. You swallow the nightmare. You swallow it down with the bile and the dust. The turning point isn't a battle. It's a realization on the German side. Captured diaries from this period show a change in tone. The confidence of April is gone, replaced by a sullen respect and a growing despair. A German officer writes, "These Australians are not men. They are demons. They fight when they should surrender. They laugh at our artillery. We cannot break them because they are already broken in a way that makes them impervious to fear. They have nothing to lose." This is the victory, not taking ground, but taking the enemy's belief in his own superiority. The idiotic plan of holding a port with rats has become a strategic masterstroke. By holding Tobruk, the Australians are denying Rommel the supply port he desperately needs to attack Egypt and the Suez Canal. They are a thorn in his side that is becoming an infected wound. Every gallon of fuel, every shell, every truck that Rommel has to divert to the siege is one less he has for the main offensive. The rats are bleeding the Afrika Korps dry, drop by drop, day by day, and they are doing it with equipment that belongs in a museum and a spirit that belongs in a legend. But legends don't eat. Legends don't bleed, men do, and Leslie is running on empty. He has lost 15 kilos. His ribs show through his skin like the hull of a starving ship. His eyes are bright with fever. He has desert sores on his legs that ooze pus and won't heal. He is exhausted beyond the capacity of language to describe. It is a bone-deep weariness that makes even lifting a spoon an effort. Yet, when the sergeant calls, "Stand to," he moves. He grabs his rifle. He goes to the parapet. It is muscle memory. It is duty. It is love for the man next to him. In August, rumors of relief begin to circulate. The Navy is going to take them out. Polish troops are coming to replace them. Leslie doesn't believe it. Rumors are cruel. Hope is dangerous. "Believe it when I see the boat, mate," he tells Smokey. But the rumors persist. And then, one night, it happens. Under the cover of a moonless dark, the destroyers slip into the harbor. Ghost ships. The loading is chaotic, but silent. No lights, no talking. The wounded go first, then the units. Leslie stands on the deck of HMAS Nizam, feeling the vibration of the engines through his boots, a different vibration than the tanks. It is the vibration of salvation. He looks back at the coastline, a dark smudge against the stars. Flares still go up over the perimeter. The war goes on. The Poles are there now, taking over the holes, the rats, the heat. But for Leslie, the siege is over. He is leaving Tobruk. But as the ship turns north, cutting through the black water of the Mediterranean, he realizes with a sinking heart that Tobruk will never leave him. The silence of the sea is terrifying after months of noise. He feels exposed, vulnerable, without his hole in the ground. He sits on the steel deck, hugging his knees, and for the first time in 241 days he cries. He cries for Rusty, for the German boy with the water, for the officer he shot, for himself. He cries because he survived, and he doesn't know why. This survival guilt will follow him. It is the invisible scar. But there is also pride, a fierce, hard pride. They did it. They held. The idiotic plan worked. The German generals aren't laughing anymore. Rommel isn't laughing. The world is watching, and for the first time in the war, the Nazi war machine has been stopped. Not by a winter, not by a vast ocean, but by 14,000 men who refused to be moved. The rats. The name is no longer an insult, it is a title, and Leslie Bluey Thompson carries it. He closes his eyes, listening to the waves, and drifts into a sleep that is finally dreamless. But the story isn't over. The war is long, and the desert has a long memory. The rats have won the Battle of Tobruk, but the cost of that victory will be paid in installments for decades to come, in the nightmares of old men, in the silence of dinner tables, in the sudden flinch at a car backfiring. The siege has ended, but the walls remain, built now not of sand and stone, but of trauma and memory. And deep in the German archives, reports are being filed, analyzing the failure. They blame the Italians. They blame the supply lines. They blame the weather. They blame everything except the truth, that they were beaten by the human spirit of men they deemed inferior. This is the ultimate irony. The master race was defeated by the common man, by the shearer, the clerk, the laborer, by Bluey. The journey home, or rather away from Tobruk, is not the end of the war for the 9th Division. It is a pause, They are sent to Palestine, then Syria. They are refitted, rested, retrained. They get new uniforms. They eat fresh fruit. They sleep in beds. But they are changed. They are harder, cynical, wary. They look at the new reinforcements, fresh-faced boys from Australia, with a mixture of pity and contempt. They don't know. Smokey whispers to Leslie one evening in a canteen in Tel Aviv. They think it's an adventure. Leslie just nods, looking into his beer. They'll learn, he says softly, or they won't. The Tobruk spirit becomes the core of the division's identity. It is a badge of honor that separates them from everyone else. Even the officers tread lightly around the veterans of the siege. There is a respect there earned in blood. But there is also a disconnect. The world outside the siege seems frivolous, loud, colorful. Leslie finds it hard to adjust to the noise of a city, the laughter of civilians. It feels fake. Only the silence of the desert felt real. This alienation is common. It is the beginning of the silence of the WW2 generation, the inability to communicate the reality of their experience to those who weren't there. Because words fail, how do you describe the sound of a Stuka to someone who hasn't heard it? It's just a noise. To Leslie, it's the sound of death hunting you, so they stay silent. They talk among themselves or not at all. Back in Germany, the Tobruk failure is being studied. Rommel is obsessed with it. He cannot let it go. It is a stain on his record. He plans his revenge. He will take Tobruk eventually in June 1942, but by then the rats will be gone and the strategic moment will have passed. The legend of his invincibility is broken. The psychological damage is done. The German soldier now knows that the British and Dominion troops can fight, can hold, can win. The fear is gone. The awe is gone. In its place is a grim determination to finish the job. The war in North Africa shifts gear. It becomes a war of attrition, of supplies, of logistics, a war the Germans cannot win in the long run. And it started here, in the dust of Tobruk, with a shearer and a rifle. Leslie receives a letter from his mother. It has been redirected 3 times. It is 2 months old. "Dad is proud of you," she writes. He doesn't say much, but he listens to the news on the wireless every night. When they talk about Tobruk, he just nods. Leslie reads this and feels a lump in his throat. His father knows. That nod is worth more than a medal. It is an acknowledgement from one survivor to another. "Welcome to the club," it says, "the club of men who have seen the edge of the world." Leslie folds the letter carefully and puts it in his pocket next to his paybook. It is an anchor, a reminder of who he was, who he might be again if he survives the next round, because there is always a next round. The war is a hungry beast, and it is not yet full. The rats of Tobruk have escaped the trap, but they are still in the cage of the war, and the most brutal battles are yet to come. Alamein is waiting, and the Pacific is calling. The rats will be needed again, and Leslie will be there, with his Lee Enfield and his scarred soul, ready to hold the line again, because that is what rats do. They survive, and they bite. The peace in Syria and Lebanon, where the 9th Division had been sent to lick its wounds, felt like a colorful, saturated lie, an insult to senses that had been calibrated to the monochromatic spectrum of grey, ochre, and dried blood of Tobruk. For Leslie Bluey Thompson, now promoted to sergeant not for ostentatious bravery, but by the simple and brutal mathematics of survival, the green of the hills and the sickly sweet smell of jasmine brought no relief. They brought nausea. It was a postcard scenery inhabited by ghosts. They walked the streets of Beirut and Tripoli in new uniforms that looked like costumes on their emaciated frames, 25-year-old men with 50-year-old eyes, startling local waiters not with violence, but with a predatory silence. The silence was the problem. In the desert, silence was a warning of an attack. Here, it was just silence, and it left Leslie's nerves in a state of constant vibration, like a violin string stretched to the breaking point. He watched Smokey Dawson laugh in a bar, but the laughter didn't reach his eyes. It was just a muscle spasm, a mimicry of who they used to be before they knew the sound a human body makes when crushed by a tank track. But the illusion of rest was shattered on June 21, 1942, not by a bomb, but by news that hit the Australian camps with the force of a physical impact, sucking the air from the lungs of 14,000 men simultaneously. Tobruk had fallen. The fortress, the symbol, the graveyard where they had buried Rusty, Jacko, and so many others, the place they had held for 241 days with fingernails, teeth, and suicidal stubbornness, had surrendered in less than 24 hours under the command of an inexperienced and poorly led South African garrison. The news brought no sadness. It brought a biblical fury, cold and white. Leslie felt as if someone had desecrated his mother's grave. They had bled for every metre of that limestone rock, had drunk brackish water, and eaten rotten-tinned meat to deny that port to Rommel. And now, in a single day of tactical incompetence, everything had been handed over. Rommel was back, and this time he wasn't just surrounding ports. He was driving his panzers east toward the Nile, toward Cairo, toward the Suez Canal. Africa hung by a thread. The Afrika Korps seemed unstoppable again, and the legend of German invincibility, which the rats had broken, was being rebuilt on the wreckage of the Allied defeat at Gazala. In Cairo, it was Ash Wednesday, with the smoke of secret documents burning at the British embassy darkening the sky, while rear echelon officers packed their bags in panic. But in the 9th Division camps, there was no panic. There was a pending reckoning. General Sir Claude Auchinleck, and later his successor Bernard Montgomery, knew they needed something harder than steel to stop Rommel at El Alamein, the last railway station before the end of the world. They needed psychological reinforced concrete. They needed the rats. When the movement order came, there were no cheers, no patriotic speeches about the Empire. There was only the dry sound of bolts being checked and the creak of equipment being adjusted. Leslie looked at Smokey as they climbed into the trucks. "They lost our cemetery, Bluey," Smokey said, his voice devoid of any human inflection. "Let's go get it back." The journey back to Egypt was a descent into Hades. The coastal road was clogged with the wreckage of the retreating army. Burnt-out vehicles, demoralized men walking in the opposite direction, staring at the Australians heading toward the front as if they were madmen or walking corpses. And perhaps they were. Leslie felt he had already died in Tobruk, and what remained was just a biological machine designed to kill Germans. They arrived at El Alamein in July, a line in the desert where the southern flank was protected by the Qattara Depression, an impassable sea of quicksand, and the north by the sea. There was no way to flank. There would be no ballet maneuvers with tanks. It would be a boxing match in a phone booth, a frontal friction clash where the winner would be whoever had more meat to put in the grinder. The 9th Division was positioned in the extreme north, near the coast, the critical point, the hinge of the entire Allied line. If they broke, Egypt fell. Rommel knew who was there. German intelligence intercepted the communications. "The Australians are back," the report said, and there was a tone of caution that hadn't existed in 1941. They knew the rats didn't retreat. July and August were months of brutal and confused fighting, the first Battle of Alamein, where Leslie learned that open desert warfare was different from a siege. Here, artillery was queen. The bombardment was constant, turning sand into glass and men into uncontrollable tremors. Leslie saw a veteran sergeant, a man who had survived Gallipoli, cry in the fetal position during a barrage of Nebelwerfer, the German rocket mortars that screamed like banshees before exploding. But Leslie didn't cry anymore. He had passed the point of fear to the point of fatality. He wrote letters home that were pure fiction. "The weather is fine. The food has improved." The truth was he was eating sand and drinking tea made with radiator water, and the only thing keeping him sane was hate. A focused, crystalline hate for the arrogance of that army that dared to think it could take the world. Then came October. Montgomery amassed an obscene force, 1,000 guns, 200,000 men. For the first time, the Allies had overwhelming material superiority. But numbers don't fight. Men fight. And Montgomery's plan for Operation Lightfoot depended on a calculated sacrifice. The Australian 9th Division was not just supposed to attack. They were to crumble the German defences in the north, drawing Rommel's panzers into a bloody war of attrition so the British armour could break through further south. They were the live bait. They were the arm that would be shoved down the wolf's throat so the other could stab it. On the night of October 23, 1942, the desert was strangely cold under a full moon that illuminated the flat, mined terrain ahead, Rommel's Devil's Garden. Leslie lay in the sand, 50 meters from the start line. He checked his watch. 21:39, 21 minutes to the end of the world. Beside him, new reinforcements. Boys from Perth and Adelaide, who had never heard a shot fired in anger, shook visibly. Leslie didn't say, "It's going to be okay." He said, "Follow me and don't stop. If you stop, you die." At 21:40, the horizon behind them dissolved into light. The Alamein barrage wasn't a sound. It was atmospheric pressure. 1,000 guns firing simultaneously created a vacuum and then a shockwave that made eardrums bleed even when protected with cotton. The ground shook like jelly. Ahead, the German lines simply disappeared under a curtain of fire and dust. It seemed impossible that anyone could survive that, but they survived. When the barrage lifted forward at 22 km, and the bagpipes, yes, bagpipes, an absurd and medieval touch in the middle of mechanized warfare, began to play Waltzing Matilda, Leslie stood up. "Forward!" he screamed, but didn't hear his own voice. They walked into the smoke. Entering the minefield was like walking into a slaughterhouse blindfolded. The S-mines, the bouncing Bettys, jumped to waist height before exploding, spraying hundreds of steel balls. Leslie saw a corporal to his right disappear in a pink cloud. 1 second he was there, running. The next he was just a wet mist and empty boots. But they continued. They had to take point 29, an insignificant rise on the map that dominated the northern sector. German and Italian infantry emerged from their deep holes, stunned, bleeding from the ears, but fighting with the desperation of those defending their own lives. Combat instantly degraded from the tactical to the primal. There were no battle lines, just groups of men stumbling in the smoke, stabbing shadows, shooting at point-blank range. Leslie found himself in a German trench, using his bayonet like a pickaxe, the rifle acting as a spear. He felt the resistance of bone and tissue, the smell of foreign sweat and gunpowder. He shot a man in the face who was trying to arm a grenade. The man fell backward, the grenade exploding under his body, muffled by flesh, a dull thud that threw Leslie against the trench wall. He wiped the blood, not his own, from his eyes, and kept going. They took point 29 by morning, but taking was the easy part. Holding was the nightmare. Rommel, realizing the threat to his northern flank, did exactly what Montgomery predicted and what Leslie feared. He threw everything he had at the Australians. Over the next few days, the 9th Division became the lightning rod for the entire Afrika Korps. They were attacked by tanks, by infantry, by Stukas, by heavy artillery. Point 29 became a lunar landscape of overlapping craters. Leslie didn't sleep for 72 hours. Water ran out. Ammunition was low. They used captured German weapons, ate German rations found on bodies. They were living inside the enemy war machine, lethal parasites refusing to be dislodged. On October 27th, the Panzers attacked again. They were Tigeries and Panzer IVs, monsters emerging from the dust. The 2-pounder anti-tank guns were useless against the frontal armor of the new tanks. The only hope was to let them get close, terrifyingly close. Leslie was in a shell hole with a newly arrived Piat, a crude spring-loaded infantry anti-tank weapon. He waited. The tank was 30 meters away. He could see the rivets on the armor. He could see the German infantry crouching behind it. Now, he whispered to himself, the sound of the outside world faded, leaving only the heartbeat in his ears and the grey steel silhouette filling his vision. He fired. The projectile hit the right track. The tank spun, exposing its side. "Smokey now!" Leslie screamed. Smokey with a Bren gun opened fire on the exposed infantry, mowing them down like ripe wheat. But another tank turned its turret toward them. Leslie saw the black hole of the 88mm cannon looking directly into his soul. There was no time to reload. There was no time to pray. There was only the absolute icy certainty that luck, that coin he had been flipping every day since 1941, had finally landed on the wrong side. The flash of the shot was the last thing he saw before the world transformed into darkness and absolute pain, a sudden and violent silence that swallowed the battle, the desert, and the memory of who he had been.